Hello. If you're watching this, that means that I did decide to actually start posting these videos I've been making about my deconstruction, Christianity in general, kind of my background, my story. Not that anybody probably cares, but it's been therapeutic for me. So I decided I'd make another one. This is, I think, my third video. I don't know if I'm going to post it or not, but also, I'm not drinking and driving. This is a beer, but I am parked. I've been at my house all day. I'm not driving around. I got a new car, and I was like, you know what? I like it in here. I enjoy it in here. It still kind of has like a new car smell, so I wanted to make a video in here today. So yeah, it's kind of gonna be. I've got my Bible. I didn't have my Bible for the first two videos because I wasn't at my house, but I am now. So I've got this bad boy. I've got the old Johnny Mack, the John MacArthur Study Bible, NIV version. This thing, I got this, I don't know, my dad gave it to me a long time ago. I don't know if I have it written down in here. Probably about 10 years ago now. And it's got a lot of notes. It's got a lot of commentary. And for those that don't know, John MacArthur, he's a pretty big pastor. He's a big evangelical fundamentalist, Calvinist pastor. He's a big dispensationalist. If you are kind of more into the weeds on theology, I'm sure you'll probably know who that is. But yeah, this is the study Bible. I got this, back. For anyone who doesn't know, if you didn't see the other videos, I've been a Bible believing, Bible thumping Christian for like almost the first 30 years of my life. Grew up in it. Disconnected, deconstructed the past year and a half or so. Still in the process of deconstruction. But yeah, I was a super fundamentalist, evangelical, young earth creationist. I believed every word in this book. I thought everything in this book was God spoken, God breathed, and useful for teaching and instruction, right? As the scriptures tell us. So along with that, I would have been, gay marriage is wrong. That's going to send you to hell. Even if you're a straight guy, straight couple, and you're having sex before marriage, that's going to send you to hell. Hell being not eternal separation, not an annihilationist kind of, oops, you're dead. It was a permanent torture forever, right? All of that very real to me. I'm not going to go through my whole spiel every time I post a video about why I left, but this video is going to cover some of the verses that I think were problematic for me, that started to present some questions for me. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it, man. I have a couple things bookmarked I'm going to go through. I've got a lot of, I highlighted, back when I was a Christian, this thing, I didn't always live the right way in terms of my morality. As a Christian, I would have said that I was, a fallen creature, and I sinned and I struggled a lot. But man, I certainly read this Bible. I mean, there's a lot of New Testament, especially. Maybe you didn't get a very good a good look there. But I mean, I have a lot of stuff, through the years that I would highlight because I lived in this book, man. I read it a lot. I knew a lot of it, and I still do know it. I probably know it better now that I'm not a Christian, but it was certainly something that I would probably be reading at least every day, trying to read at least every day a little bit. But it's different, coming at it from this new perspective of, I don't think this stuff is all inerrant anymore. I don't think it's all 100% accurate. And I think it's got some problematic stuff in it. So first off, I want to tackle this, and I've talked about this before because this was a big factor for me. Slavery. It's a big buzzword, obviously. You'll see most Christians will say, I guess all Christians will say, when atheists and agnostics claim the Bible promotes slavery, that is an extremist characterization, that is fallacious, that is not getting the full context, right? They talk a lot about context, Christians do. So I want to give you the context here, okay? As much as I can, because I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not, I don't know Hebrew. I don't know Greek. It's all Greek to me, as they say, but I know what the text says, right? And this is from the NIV version. So Exodus 21. And before I start this, I'm probably going to have people, if I post this, say, dude, the Old Testament is not, people will say it's not the same, that the New Testament is really where we get our teachings from. That's where we have Jesus. The Old Testament, you shouldn't be hung up on the Old Testament. But I would just challenge those same Christians to ask them, well, is the Old Testament part of the Bible? Is the Old Testament correct and accurate? And of course they're going to say yes, if they're a fundamentalist, because they have to. And you realize pretty quickly, if you don't have the Old Testament and you don't believe in the Old Testament, you don't have Adam and you don't have Abraham and Moses and the genealogy of Christ through David, then you don't really have Jesus. You can have a guy named Jesus, but there's not really a reason for him if you don't have the prophecies and you don't have this Messiah that's foretold in the Old Testament. Basically, it's a very cohesive book in one way, in the sense that it's an overarching message, and you cannot have the Old Testament without the New. You have to have the Old Testament for Jesus. So this passage in Exodus 21 is talking about idols and altars, and it's talking about Hebrew slaves, because there's a distinction. The ancient Israelites and God, I guess you would say, Yahweh, made a distinction between Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves. Slaves that weren't from the tribe of Israel, slaves that were from their enemies, from foreign lands, Canaanites, Moabites, Amalekites, all those guys, right? So this here is the laws, right? These are the laws of slavery for Hebrews. And this is Exodus 21. These are the laws you are to set before them, Hebrew servants. Verse 2, Exodus 21, 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. So far, so good. Okay. I mean, it's still slavery. It's a Hebrew slave. You're talking about buying somebody, buying a human being, but you're letting him go after 7 years. You're letting his wife go. Oh, okay. This could conceivably better, at least, than what we would say is maybe our modern pictures of slavery, somewhat. So, right, he is to go free alone. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. Verse 4, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. Okay, so let's think about that. So after this 7-year period, when he's going to be allowed to go free, if he showed up single and his slave master gave him a wife, said, here you go. Which again, besides the problems of a slave master giving a human being to a slave, I guess that's kind of like double slavery. Anyways, if you give that slave a wife and they have a baby, they have kids, and that slave at the end of that 7-year period, he goes, I'm free now. I'm allowed to go, but damn, little Johnny and my wife, I'm going to have to leave them here. And I've been a slave for 7 years. I haven't been making any money. It's not like I have a lot of good economic prospects. Kind of seems like it's maybe a better deal for me to just stay here and be a slave forever, because at least I'll have a wife and my baby, my children that I've been around the last 7 years. And my master, he's a pretty nice guy. He gave me a wife. He doesn't beat me too much, or he gives me Saturdays off. You can rationalize it, right? So that was verse 4, right? If his master gave him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. Verse 5. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Not an owl like OWL. It's AWL. I think it's it's basically like, how cows have those little tags sometimes on their ears or whatever to markate either information about the cow or who owns it, or even a branding on the cow. It's basically, if this slave says, I love my master, I love my wife and kids, I have nowhere to go, I want to stay here. Then the master says, great news, buddy. We're going to go down to the judges, we go down to the courthouse, and we're going to give you a little earpiece that says property of me. And that way you get to be mine forever and you get to stay with your wife and kids. Isn't that wonderful, right? It's a carrot and a stick. This is again, Exodus 21. Christians are going to say context, context, context. I'm reading the text for what it says, and what it literally says is that if you own a Hebrew as a slave of one of your fellow Hebrews, which is permitted, after 7 years, you have to let that guy go. Okay? But if you give him a wife and then he has kids, that's your property. That child is your property. It's not his property. But don't worry, he can stay in he can stay in his child's life if he decides to devote the rest of his life to serving you. Okay? That is it's not a verse that I ever read when I was a Christian. Maybe I was in parts of Exodus. I certainly wasn't in this part. This chapter 21 was not a chapter that I was ever taught. Certainly wasn't taught it in Sunday school as a kid. Never heard it as an adult. Maybe you have in your church. But this to me seems pretty plainly God prescribing laws for slavery, and I'm kind of giving like a little bit of a cheat code in the sense of like this is a nice way for you to keep your male slaves from leaving you, right? Okay. So that's problematic. I don't think I have to really explain why that's problematic. I don't know what kind of context you could present to me that would justify this. I don't know. I really don't. But there's another verse in Leviticus that talks about more regulations on the practice of owning slaves and buying slaves, because again, people are going to say, and I don't know how they would know this because nobody was there 2,000 years ago, but they'll say, this dude, slavery back then, when the Bible uses the word slavery, it's not talking about like when we're thinking about pre-Civil War American slavery, right? Or anywhere, in the modern times. It's not like that. It was more like indentured servitude. The Jews were doing these people favors. They were giving them housing and shelter. Again, I would just say, if you really think about what you're trying to justify there, you're still justifying the practice of a human being that's owned by somebody else. And I would say, even if they were the best masters ever, they let them get Saturdays off, they let them do whatever, it's an extremely evil practice to be regulating other human beings as property, and the Bible does not condemn that practice. It actually prescribes rules on how to keep people your slaves for longer, that I just read. Okay, let's move on. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39. Okay, this is starting in verse 39. This is a little long, but this is again, let's see what the beginning of the chapter says. Talking about the year of Jubilee. These are just a lot of the laws that you'll see in books like Leviticus. Leviticus 25, verse 39. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you, and they are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. So this is kind of conflicting what we just read in Exodus about Hebrew slaves, servants. Here it seems like in Leviticus they're saying you should not have an Israelite slave. Exodus talks about how to keep an Israelite slave as your slave for life. So again, you could say that's a contradiction. That's not even the point of this. But anyways, so they are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Okay, sounds pretty good. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. So this is God talking, right? They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Okay. Hell yeah, dude. Here we go. We got God saying, no slaves. It's bad. Do not rule over them. They're my people. Love that. Okay. Here we go. That was the end of verse 43. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Verse 44. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Okay, so pretty quickly after God saying, I'm not okay with this, we find out, he is okay with slavery. It's just not with his chosen people. The Old Testament God is very much a in-group, out-group pick me kind of us versus them God, right? So don't touch my people. But your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you buy your slaves. Verse 45. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and the members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. Into verse 45. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Again, putting that kind of favoritism of you can treat these foreigners not so nice maybe, but don't do it to your fellow Jews. Have some decency, people. Come on, right? Again, this is God's prescription. You know, a lot of people will say the Bible doesn't prescribe slavery. The Bible talks about slavery. It talks about it in the context of the time. No, this is God explicitly giving commands about which people you can own and how you can treat them and why there's a difference between a Jewish slave and a non-Jewish slave. This is God playing favorites. This is God saying that I don't value other people groups besides this group that I've kind of arbitrarily chosen to be my chosen people, right? It's I don't know. It's hard to justify, man. And again, this is another passage that I never would have did not read when I was a Christian. You are not hearing about this in Sunday school. But if you come from the biblicist and errant Bible tradition, like I have, what do you do with verses like this? When you are told every verse in here is not only true, but is useful, that is God inspired, that has a purpose for teaching, for evangelism, for your own walk with the Lord, with your marriage, whatever. This is supposed to be helpful. This is supposed to be, I want to live a better life for Christ through reading this book, through getting the knowledge of this book. I don't know, man. That's a tough pill to swallow. This video, like I think all my videos, it's not super organized. I know I'm kind of jumping around, but I wanted to kind of just briefly talk about the slavery stuff because I get kind of irked. I see so often Christians will say, like, it's such a mischaracterization for atheists or agnostics to claim that the Bible prescribes slavery. I just gave you two passages that are like pretty explicit rules about how to handle your slaves. If you want to fight with me and say that that's actually a form of indentured servitude, not slavery, great. You can die on that hill if you want. I think if you're being intellectually honest, you will still admit after reading these passages, again, you can bequeath them as your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. This is talking about owning another human being for their entire life and for keeping their bloodline, their family line within your family because you own them as property. Bequeathing them means giving them, right, as a gift. That's fucked up, okay? That's fucked up. All right, what else did I have? This is kind of a fun one. So we've got, this is 2 Kings. This is just a quick one I wanted to read because absolutely, like, insane passage. Like, insane. And I didn't know about this one when I was a Christian. Another one that I would not have ever been taught. And it's actually, I want to clarify, I think I've said before, I think most of the Old Testament is not history. I think most of it is folklore and mythological tales. I think there's some history in it. You do see that there are real people in there, real Babylonian kings and real figures of history. However, I don't think that this story I'm about to read happened. Thank God I don't think it happened. Excuse me. When I was a Christian, I would have said, if you would have confronted me with this verse, I would have said, that's a tough one, man, but God's got his reasons, and I do believe that this is a literal thing that happened in history, right? Okay, so we're in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23. Elisha is jeered, okay? Elisha, I don't know if it's Elijah. I mean, it's with an SHA, so I think it's Elisha. Elisha was one of God's anointed, right? He was one of God's prophets, okay? And prophets in the Old Testament, pretty big deal. Okay? If you're speaking for God, you kind of are like a badass. You're kind of like, dude, that guy's pretty sick, because you're getting this divine word from God, and it's revelation, and you're anointed by him, and you're chosen. The Jews were his chosen people, right? But if you're a prophet, you're like double chosen. You're like chosen within the chosen. It's like a chosenception, like an inception type thing, right? Okay. So 2 Kings 2:23. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. Jeered, made fun of him, right? Was just kind of busting his balls. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. "Get out of here, Baldy." That's not just me repeating it. They said it twice. Verse 24. He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. 42. And he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there returned to Samaria. Short and sweet, and that's it. That's like the whole passage. We have the next verses. That's chapter 3 is after that, talking about the Moab revolts, which I haven't read that. I'm sure there's some absolutely horrible shit that is going on in that passage. But yeah, so this is short and sweet. We have a quick passage here about one of God's prophets being made fun of by a group of, it says boys. I think the apologetics people will say, well, boys were actually like, that's like teenage men. That's like, they were like grown men or whatever. You want to say they weren't youth, you want to say they weren't minors. I don't really care. That's honestly beside the point. This to me could say a group of men, a group of grown men said, "Get out of here, Baldy." He was so offended that he cursed them, and maybe this could be a little more palatable if it was like, look how the curse was like God struck him dead like that. In Acts, I think we see God struck down that married couple for lying. Again, seems a little harsh. Maybe this one is more justified because they were actually making fun of this guy. But you could have struck him dead. You could have unalived him right away. No, instead, it was 2 bears. And I'm guessing, I don't know where Bethel is, but geographically speaking, there must be grizzlies, maybe? I don't know if this is a polar bear, but they had they went on a 42 kill streak. That's very impressive. That's a substantial amount of kills, right? But I want to say, I don't think this happened. I think I shouldn't say there's no way this happened. I can't ever say that for certain, but as a Christian, I would have said this happened, and it's unfortunate, but this shows, I would have gave some sort of, bullshit. This shows that God is sovereign and the power of Almighty God. What a terrifying thing it is to fall into the hands of Almighty God. And these kids they got their just desserts. They should not have spoken against the Lord's anointed. And that's what happens. And this story is a true story, and it's in the Bible because it is meant to serve as an illustration for future Christians that this is serious shit, okay? And you are not to question God's anointed. You are not to question God's plans, right? That's probably what I would say. Now I would just say this shows like a homicidal maniac, like anger management problem out the ass, like extreme impulse control needing God, who is like, oh, what you called? Not even me. You called one of the people I created. You called my boy Elijah. You called him Baldy. And we're gonna have to just send those grizzlies right out there to kill those kids. I don't know, man. I don't know. Now my study Bible's got it's got a bunch of notes in it. I'm assuming from Johnny Mack himself. I'm gonna do I want to read and see if these are what kind of justifications that the study guide notes give for this, if any. Okay, so of course. Boys, so my commentary says these were not children, but infidels and idolatrous young men in their late teens or 20s. So, of course, they're men. And they have to be men, right? According to this interpretation, if you're a biblicist, they couldn't really have been little boys, because if they were, that's God killing kids Okay? And God wouldn't do that. So that comes to kind of the special pleading thing that Christians they are forced to engage in. By saying, no, these were actually, if you look at the text, you look at the ancient, the text, it actually means they were in their 20s or 30s. I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just kind of reading here quickly what it says. And baldy, so there's a note on the insult baldy, right? This says, baldness was regarded as a disgrace. And it's a really big deal. These youths were sarcastically taunting and insulting the Lord's prophet by telling him to repeat Elijah's translation. Okay. I'm trying to see this. So they don't even really try to justify it, I guess, besides the fact that these people are older than little kids. So the curse, because these people of about 20 years of age or older despised the Lord, Elijah called upon the Lord to deal with the rebels as he saw fit. The Lord's punishment was the mauling of 42 youths by the 2 female bears. The penalty was clearly justified. For to ridicule Elisha was to ridicule the Lord himself. The gravity of the penalty mirrored the gravity of the crime. The appalling judgment was God's warning to any and all who attempted to interfere with the newly invested prophet's ministry. So even a very fundamentalist evangelical pastor like John MacArthur will say, this is an appalling judgment, right? He will admit that's appalling. That is a gruesome, horrifying thing that we're seeing here, right? But it has to be justified because God's morality, this is divine command theory, right? Everything that God prescribes, everything that God orders has to be moral because God is the giver of morality. How could he do anything that's not moral? Because he is the creator of morality. But that's a logical fallacy. It really is. And people will say, Christians will say, you are wrong to try to apply human standards of morality upon God because he's not human and he created morality and he created us. And how dare you be one of these little kids, one of these youths that says, hey, baldy, okay? How dare you do that? And you deserve to be mauled for saying that, right? I just think that's like pretty gross, dude. I just think that's kind of disgusting. Because I think I'm allowed to question and to say, man, God does some pretty horrible things, and Christians have to say that that's not actually horrible because God did it. But if a human being did it, it would be. And then we'll have to, we come to these kind of like, to me, they're kind of like conversation enders. The rebuttal of like, you know, you're just a little guy, dude, and you could never ever, you could never fully comprehend what God's plan is and how his timing is and all of that. I think that's a cop-out. I think that's a really weak answer. I would have once upon a time given that as my answer. I don't think that's very compelling anymore. I guess you would say, well, that's because the Holy Spirit left you, dude. Of course, you're not going to find it compelling anymore. I don't know. I think that it's fair to ask the God who is going to send me to hell forever for committing sins. It's fair to ask him to be a pretty decent guy, right? Because I've made a lot of mistakes. I've done a lot of what would be categorized as sinful things. I've never killed anybody. I certainly have never ordered a bears to kill children, to even kill 20-something-year-old men. I haven't even done that, which is, I know, kind of crazy. I haven't ever owned any slaves, and I haven't given people instructions about how to own slaves and how to kind of trick your slave into staying your slave for longer if you give them a wife and a kid. I've never done that. But God has. He's done it a lot. I just read about some of those things, right? Okay. Let's see. I think we're heading to the New Testament now, okay? This is going to be one last thing I want to just briefly touch on. And then I'm going to be done, okay? So we're taught as Christians that the Bible is harmonious, right? In that the theology that it presents is coherent. Within the New Testament especially, that the doctrines of Paul and Peter and James and, of course, Jesus, they all fit together. They're not contradictory. They all are teaching the same thing. They're all pointing towards the same thing, right? We would say that Jesus was God and that he died. And once he died, the Holy Spirit came down and dwelled in all the apostles and the disciples. And then Paul carried that torch. And everything Paul said is 100% God inspired and divine, right? And that nothing that, for instance, nothing Paul said would be at odds with anything Jesus said. And nothing James said could be at odds with anything that Paul said, right? And I used to believe that, but I just don't know if I think that's true anymore. Well, I know I don't think it's true anymore. Okay, and let me just kind of talk about briefly where I'm coming from with that. Paul teaches to me pretty clearly this, it's not free grace, but it is the doctrine of believe and you are saved, right? That the gift of salvation is for those that believe will get that gift, right? I think that's pretty clear that that's what he teaches. I'll give you a couple verses to illustrate that that's Paul's theology. Now, if we look at Ephesians 2, chapter 8 through 9. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast, right? So this is kind of like Paul is saying here, the way that you get to heaven, the way that God saves you, it's through faith, it's through belief, right? Nothing you can do can get you there. There's no actions you can do that's going to get you in heaven. Now, for the full context, I'm going to read verse 10 does say, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So Paul is not saying that you won't do good works. He's saying that we were created for that explicit purpose. But he is saying that you are not saved by works. That's explicit. It is by grace you have been saved, not by works. Okay, so Paul has this message of to believe in Jesus will get you to be saved, and then your works will naturally, you will have works, but it's not a requirement. It's not a prerequisite, right? And there's more verses where he talks about that, right? Kind of this idea of like, there's no human action that you can do that's going to save you. It's all based upon belief, and it's all based upon God's predestination, God choosing you, right? Okay, Romans 9, which is like the Calvinism chapter, it speaks a lot about this, okay? It talks about Israel's unbelief, Romans 9, verse 32, talking about the Israelites. The people of Israel who pursued the law as the way of righteousness have not attained their goal. Pursuing the law meaning what? Trying to live up to a works-based system of keeping God's Old Testament commandments, right? But Paul says they have not attained that goal. Verse 32, why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, right? As it is written, see, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall, and the one who believes in him will never be put to shame, right? But it's, again, this emphasis not on works, not on what you've done, okay? But we see that James doesn't really have that same stance. That James says some things that kind of butt up against that, right? And again, this is a quick example. I know I'm going to get slaughtered. Christians are going to be saying, you're understanding this so wrong. Works and faith are compatible, and here's how you read it. Again, I'm just going through what the text says. I just gave you some pretty explicit verses of Paul putting an emphasis on faith and telling you that the Israelites are not going to be saved by keeping the law, that it is by grace alone that you are saved, not through works, right? It's very clear. He hammers that point multiple times in his letters. But we could turn to James 2, verse 14, faith and deeds. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accomplished by action, is dead. Someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder, right? And that used to always really scare me when I was a kid, because I was always taught you got to just pray the prayer, man. You know, you're going to be baptized. And if you believe, you know, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, you know, that whosoever believe in him shall not perish. I was always taught it's about belief. But it was still verses like this that saying, dude, belief alone, that's not enough, bro. Even the demons believe that, and they shudder. And, of course, the demons are not going to get a second chance, right? We know where they're going at the end. So it was this kind of, I didn't recognize it as a contradiction at the time, but now I can see pretty clearly that, like, even Jesus, Paul, James, Peter, they all kind of have different flavors on what ratio of faith to works is really required and to be saved. And I just think I'll do more videos about this because there's other topics similar to this that I think you see that the apostles are not in agreement on. But this one to me is pretty clear to where they were not all on the same page about, is this still a works-based thing like kind of the Old Testament Judaism where it was like, okay, we're still having to keep the law, you know, because a lot of people will say Jesus came to abolish the law, right? But that's not true. You know, Jesus literally says, I don't know what verse it is, but I know it's in one of the Gospels. I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, right? So this works-based emphasis is still very heavy in the New Testament. Paul is really the main guy who is speaking out against this works-based doctrine, right? And I think the reason for that is his messaging was primarily to the Gentiles, right? He was speaking to the non-Jews, right? And he wanted this message to be palpable to them, right? He wanted this message he wanted it to catch on. It was early on. He wanted the cult of Christianity to blow up. And he realized, Paul was a smart guy. I think he realized if we keep up with this kind of keeping the law requirement, kind of this, you need to kind of chop your penis off, and you need to not eat this kind of shellfish, and you need to not do anything on the Sunday, the Sabbath, whatever day it is. Like, he realized that's a losing formula. Like, that's not very popular. Greeks and the Romans, they don't really seem to vibe with that very much. So how about this? How about instead of having to keep the law, it changes into something of, if you believe this message in your heart, that's what's really required. And of course, works are important, but the works are going to follow from that, right? I just think the further away I get from it, the more that I pull myself out and I really try to look at Christianity as if I were studying Islam or Mormonism or Judaism, I think it's just, there's a lot of holes, man. There's a lot of stuff that is not really coherent. You know, we're taught that this is one book of coherent truth and that everything in here coincides, you know, fits together perfectly. And I don't think it does, man. I just don't think it does. One last thing, you know, I was in Romans 9 earlier. I'm going to just read some more from that. This is kind of unrelated, but Calvinism was a big part of my Christianity and a big part of my deconstruction too, kind of this belief of you're predestined for heaven or hell. There's free will, but you're just, whether or not you're going to heaven is not really part of your free will. That's a decision that God makes. And a lot of Christians don't believe that. A lot of Christians will say, no, it's free will. It is my choice. I was lost. I found God and he saved me, right? I chose him, not the other way around. I'll just say, I think I like that idea better. Free will sounds more palpable, like as a human being, to think that I could choose God, that I wasn't just made as a robot. But scripturally, biblically, the Bible doesn't support that worldview. I think the Bible pretty clearly supports this idea of God predestined each individual for heaven or hell before they were even born. And what you do on earth doesn't really matter because God's decided it already, right? And here's some verses to support that in Romans 9. So Romans 9:11. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So talking about when Jacob and Esau were born, Jacob was blessed, right? If you remember the story, Jacob was extremely blessed by God, got his favor. Esau not so much for a while. Then he ended up being okay. But here we have Jacob is loved, Esau I hated. Before they came out of the womb, God had decided the trajectory of their lives and where they were going to go, right? And Paul realizes that this doesn't sound very, very appetizing. Verse 14. But then shall we say, is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not, therefore, depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Again, going back to this idea of nothing you do is going to be good enough. It's not even going to be close. Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. That's verse 18. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but again, I encourage anybody, open your Bible. These verses are in there. I guarantee it. I'm not making this up. And it's just Paul's tone through here, right? Verse 19. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who is able to resist his will? Great question. Hypothetical Paul debate partner who's asking him, this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But Paul's response, but who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? What if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his powers known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? Okay, that is how Paul describes human beings that are not saved, that are not Christians. They are, God has choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bearing with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction. God views humans, according to Paul, as objects of wrath that he has prepared for destruction. Now, maybe if you're an annihilationist, you can say, well, that's destruction just means eternal separation. Good. I hope you're right. But still, kind of this idea of like, you are just, it's like a lottery, man. It's literally like you got to be born and God's got to choose you. Because if he doesn't, you're that piece of clay that's going to be destined to be made into a trash can instead of a nice vase. That's not God's problem. He gets to choose how to make you, man. He gets to make whatever he wants out of you. Someone like Judas, you're predestined. He was definitely predestined for destruction. He didn't have a choice. But that's just under this system. Under Calvinism, that's just. Because everybody deserves to be destroyed. And the ones that don't get destroyed, that God chooses to save, how blessed are those people, right? And those people should just feel lucky, essentially. And tough nuts for everybody else. All right? I just think that is a toxic and harmful ideology, because it really, believing this stuff as a kid, believing that I'm just like a lump of clay and that my purpose is only going to be fulfilled through whatever God decides to do with me. I think it's bad for a person's self-esteem, man. I think it's bad for your sense of self-worth. At least it can be. I know it was for me, because I kind of got to the point where I was believing that I am just this worthless, sinful, evil creature, and nothing I'm ever going to be able to do is good enough. Clearly, that's the message I'm getting here, is that I'm just this worthless, rag. And I really hope that I was predestined for salvation and that God has chosen me to be saved. Because if not, I don't have any room to complain, according to Paul. According to Paul, I've got original sin. I'm guilty, and I deserve to go to hell for that. And praise be to God if he decides to save me from that fate, which I deserve. That is something that isn't something I believe anymore. I'm glad I don't believe it anymore, because I think it's a damaging and harmful ideology. But yeah, I think that's all I got right now. I appreciate you watching this, if you are watching this, and probably come up with some more stuff soon. Thanks.